Democrats, Deputy Holly Cairns, sharing?
Just me.
Just myself.
Yeah. If it's okay, I have a brief statement and then 3 questions for the Minister. Like many, I'm outraged at the killing of George Floyd and the treatment of Black Lives Matter protesters in the US. As public representatives, it's important to respond to these events. It's important that we listen to the voices of those affected and amplify them. We cannot ignore this. That is how racism thrives. But we also need to reflect on racism in Ireland. This includes the inhumane direct provision system, attitudes to travellers and everyday racism suffered by Black people and other people of colour. COVID-19 has revealed and heightened inequalities. It has disproportionately impacted the vulnerable. Poor and disadvantaged communities have vastly higher contraction and death rates. We can see this in our nursing homes, direct provision centres and meat processing plants. The elderly, people with disabilities, migrants and low-paid workers are too easily overlooked. The pandemic has highlighted these neglected areas. It did not create them. As public representatives, we must rise to these circumstances. Meet racism with equality, disadvantage with justice and fear with hope. This crisis is an opportunity for deep reflection. It has forced us to rethink what really matters. Our society needs to change to reflect the hard-learned lessons of this pandemic. We need a new social contract. The state needs to fulfil its responsibility. Neither the voluntary sector or the market are there to relieve that responsibility. At the beginning of this emergency, 3 things we were told could not happen were achieved: a single-tier health service, rent freezes and a reduction in emissions. In the midst of a global tragedy, we put people first. This needs to continue. As restrictions are lifting, we need to be cognizant about not going back to business as usual. Business as usual was thousands on hospital trolleys, rapidly rising homelessness, hours in traffic and a crumbling ecosystem. If we have not learned that we need to prioritise people, families and communities now, when will we? A rights-based approach is essential for progression. The right to a home, to healthcare, to equality. And with that, no regression of our existing hard-earned rights. For example, next year we will be reviewing our termination of pregnancy law, and we only need to look at last night's debate in Stormont on abortion legislation to realise that we cannot be complacent. We all want to live in a more just society. The community and rural development sector is crucial to helping bring about a better, fairer and more just Ireland. Minister, I have 3 questions. Community and voluntary organisations have been severely impacted by the pandemic. At the same time, these groups have done incredible work in supporting vulnerable people. While the Covid-19 Stability Fund provided support for charities and social enterprises, it also highlighted their precarious position. An effective community sector should not be relying on fundraising to provide essential services. There's an abdication of responsibility to properly fund disadvantaged communities and vulnerable groups. The state outsources the provision of services to overstretched organisations, dedicated volunteers and people's generosity. Despite coronavirus, there has been incredible creativity in fundraising, but mental health charities, people with disabilities and older people should not have to rely on sponsored runs, coffee mornings and Instagram challenges for funding. Minister, can you ensure that your department will move towards a properly resourced community sector with multi-annual funding, enabling these groups to operate with greater security? Also, many smaller local groups did not have the capacity to demonstrate how they met the requirements for the Covid-19 Stability Fund. Groups such as parenting support programmes, family resource centres and youth clubs will have to incur substantial additional costs if they are to reopen following the government guidelines. These costs are not provided for by the Stability Fund. Minister, will you expand the current fund, widen its definition to include costs associated with COVID reopening and provide a more suitable process to facilitate smaller groups in applying? As rural TDs, we know that there is a desperate need to invest in our communities as we emerge from COVID. While I welcome your Rural Development Investment Programme, I would like to see more ambitious funding. 30 million will not cover the amount required to ensure social infrastructure in all towns and villages. COVID-19 has shown that in Ireland, community comes first. Government needs to respond in the same way. We need a new community-led initiative to create inclusive social infrastructure and public spaces. We need projects that will foster community well-being while also helping local businesses, encouraging tourism. Biodiverse parks can create and educate children and provide space for exercise and socialising. Inclusive design of streets will enable older people and people with disabilities to feel more safe and welcome. We need to move away from the matched funding model. The department needs to invest and put trust in communities who know what is best for their own area. Participative decision-making and subsidiarity will enhance active communities and local democracy. Minister, will you expand the current rural and community funding streams with a focus on inclusive public spaces? And will your department take a more participative approach in operating these programmes? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deputy. Thank you very much for your comments. Just as I said earlier, my department sits on a number of groups, particularly with the Department of Justice and Equality, and in relation to, I suppose, migrant, immigration, traveller rights groups, and all the issues that you have raised are raised at these forums. And most of these groups, like the Roma strategy and the different groups, we actually fund them from my department. Now, you raised in relation to the charities, and you're quite correct. Charities have gone through a very difficult time since this crisis, and the charity regulator did a briefing to me in relation to how these charities are responding and what's happening. And I'll just give you a few pointers. The impact has been very severe on all charities. 55% of respondents said that their charity finances were uncertain and they were in difficulty. 55%. 45% said that their funding was fairly okay between now and the end of the year. And but there is no doubt about it, they all said that their fundraising activities had to be stopped because of the crisis. And to be fair to some of the charities, to be fair to some of them, they have looked at new ways and new initiatives. And in all fairness to RTE and even the Late Late Show and shows like that have highlighted some of the charities that their funding was cut. And I must say this, and I cannot put this on the record often enough. We have a wonderful country. Sometimes people knock this country, but this is a fantastic country. They have a fantastic mindset. How so many people every Friday night, every single day of the week support charities. And you raised about social enterprises. You know, most of these were able to operate. We didn't cut back in any of the funding and in any of our funding channels that we have for these groups. We did not cut it back. In fact, we've been very lenient to them, and rightly so, because we learned one thing in this crisis. But for the voluntary sector, the community sector, we'd have serious problems in this country. And the volunteers, you know, people talk about volunteers and people giving off their time. We have volunteers in this country. You know, 17,000 people, when we had the community call, put their hands up and said, we're ready to volunteer. People didn't know what volunteer centres were and what they did and what we were funding them for. We get them extra funding. And these centres, these volunteer centres are there, and they matched up people with organisations that needed support, needed help. But the one word that I must say is volunteers. Thank them on behalf of the government and on behalf of the country, the way that they have responded again, the way that they have put their lives at risk, the way that they have responded to the community call. I cannot just thank them enough and say, well done, we're a great country. In relation to my own department, that's why we have the 40 million.
The amount of reliance we have on those voluntary sectors, and I suppose part of one of the questions is, do you acknowledge that maybe there's an over-reliance on them having to fundraise and that the state shouldn't abdicate responsibility in that sense?
Well, the state is not going to be able to fund everything, and there's no point pretending. There's a lot of organisations out there, there's a lot of groups out there, and in fact, if you look at the Community Services Programme and the funding that my department fund, and you see all the groups, and you'll be amazed with all the groups. And maybe that's one of the things that we should be looking at, this 5 million innovation fund, that we should be looking at ways and means to do business differently. And maybe we should be looking at some of these groups that are there, maybe they can amalgamate with other groups to work together to be able to provide the same services. There's a lot of groups out there, there's a lot of services out there, but I'm saying that I would never be critical of the voluntary groups. I would never be critical of the groups that we're supporting, because it's only in a time of crisis that we actually see how some of these groups actually work. But, you know, you asked the question. No, the state is not going to be able to fund every single group in this country. We'd have new groups every day, and we have. And the minute they're set up, they want to become a national organisation. And the minute they're set up, then they want a CEO and they want to be able to employ staff, and we can't do that. we have to limit, and in fact I had to make decisions last year in relation to groups that were there, and particularly in relation to funding they were getting, they were to get it over a number of years, and they were supposed to become self-sufficient themselves. But that didn't happen. I had to still come along and fund some of the groups because they were doing essential service, and it's not easy when they get funding from the state. It's very hard to take them away from them.